Thanks for the invitation to speak to you all. I don't think there were a lot of people at my presentation in Asham because it conflicted with something that on paper was at least far more interesting. However, what I said there did galvanise a few people, including some of the officials, and after having thrown out a few challenges, I really thought I needed to back it up with a more detailed paper. And so actually the paper was written after the Asham meeting. And I'm actually perpetually updating it with new studies that might come out or new bits of information to try and keep it current. So if anyone wants the latest copy, they should probably look on the ACON website or on NAPWA's website, or it'll be on the websites. And I will be doing another edition of it in March, because we have the CROI conference, which is the major scientific conference, and I think there will be quite a bit of new information presented at CROI, which is being held in Seattle, to inform our strategies around prevention and treatment, and to reinforce some of the findings about earlier treatment and the added benefit of treatment as prevention. So we all know these statistics, but I think I like to show them at every presentation so we don't go too far from reality, the reality of individuals living with HIV and unfortunately becoming infected at a rapid rate, and there are many people still dying every day of HIV/AIDS. And we've got 1,000 new infections happening every year in Australia, which is, to many of us, far too many. So, I mean, I'll just set the scene for the talk, which is a bit of a scan of the environment that we're all working in at the moment. I think we've come to another crossroad at the epidemic. There have been 3 or 4 over the last 25, 30 years. We've got more knowledge than ever before, and we've got more weapons, if you like, to fight the epidemic. However, just at this juncture, we've got a real threat to the money to fund HIV and AIDS, particularly a threat to money provided by donors so that the epidemic can continue to be tackled at a high rate in places like Africa and Eastern Europe, Asia, etc. So it's really unfortunate that we have the global financial crisis happening at this time, but that really shouldn't be any excuse for inaction, because if money is spent now, it will save a lot more money over time, and I'll come back to that theme a little bit later. So as I mentioned, we've got a lot more scientific information on HIV treatment, the same for prevention, and there's all these buzzwords floating around like combination prevention, test and treat, and prevention plus treatment, which I think are being interpreted in a multitude of ways. Some of the interpretations are correct and wise, others are way off the track. There's quite a lot of confusion, not only amongst, I think, some people with HIV and those at high risk, but also amongst people working in the field, including our own community-based colleagues. And part of the reason for writing the paper was to try and lay out some of these developments in a reasonably accessible form. Now, what really has been driving a lot of this is the fact that we actually have a global plan for HIV, which was adopted in 2001. And last year, in June, the United Nations General Assembly got together to adopt a new plan, a new global plan for HIV. And it has some very important implications, not just for our own domestic response and that of other countries, but also for the international response. This plan was adopted unanimously by every country in the General Assembly, and so we have every country committed to new targets and new actions which are based on the scientific information advances that we've seen in recent times. So it really is quite a big deal. And this declaration will drive the work done by the World Health Organization, by UNAIDS and other agencies, UNDP, etc. Their work plans, their targets and goals will be matched and driven by this new global plan. And quite frankly, so should ours in Australia. That's our commitment, to implement the commitments, and there are many of them, in the Declaration. So, with that bit of an introduction, here's the focus of today's talk. It's based on the new scientific information, and it's based on the commitments that Australia and other countries have made under the 2012 Declaration on AIDS. And what the talk argues is that we need new measures to maximise the impact of HIV treatment in Australia. We need to revolutionise our prevention efforts, and to do this, we will need to take new actions supported by time-bound targets to achieve those two ends. So the topics I'm going to cover, I've already talked about the UN Declaration on HIV and its implications. I'm going to cover the new scientific information on prevention. I'm going to propose a new overall goal for our HIV response, and then I'm going to talk about actions, targets and timelines which might help us reach that goal. So the implications of 2011 UN Declaration I've covered, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if you look at the UNAIDS website, you'll find lots of information, the declaration itself, and also what the UN system is doing to promote and implement the declaration. As I mentioned, it's a new global plan. There are many, many actions and targets in the plan, and it was something of an achievement to get them in the document because many countries were initially resistant to having targets. The argument being, well, what happens if we don't reach them? Well, I think that's a rather defeatist approach, but fortunately everyone got on board with targets. And so the new global prevention targets, which are the centrepiece, are to reduce sexual transmission of HIV by 50%, to reduce transmission through injecting drug use by 50%, and to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV. These are bold targets, and if we met them, we'd be going a long way towards ending the epidemic. Just a few other implications of the declaration. For the first time in any United Nations document endorsed by all countries, we have men who have sex with men, injecting drug users and sex workers actually named in the document. Before that, they'd always been euphemistically referred to as vulnerable groups or marginalised communities, but never actually named. So that's a huge advance, and it's going to be reflected in all sorts of declarations on human rights and other things. So that's great. The other important thing is that the declaration recognised that these three populations are universal. Every country has them. And therefore, and they're also the most vulnerable groups as well, in terms of across every country. So it's important that priority is given to actions which reach and educate and provide treatment to these vulnerable populations. Now, they're not the only populations, but I said they're universal. There will be other populations which are at high risk depending on the pattern of each country's epidemic. The goal of providing universal access to all citizens in prevention and treatment by 2015 was again set, and that's important. There are many other important targets, one of which I just highlight, which is an emphasis on the role of youth in ending the epidemic. We really have to engage young people, and young people will hopefully lead us to the end of this epidemic. And finally, just to mention Australia's role in the epidemic, our ambassador to the UN, Gary Quinlan, co-facilitated the whole process. This was a huge honour for him and a big responsibility, and he did a magnificent job. And so Australia really led the UN Declaration. The fact that we've done that means we've created expectations, and these will be that we will practice what we preach, that we will implement, hopefully be amongst the first countries to fully implement the UN Declaration. So the pressure will be on us, and I think that's great for us working in the field. We can build on that and use that as a hook for advocacy. Okay, so now moving on to some of the new scientific information, firstly beginning with treatment. To sum all of this up, it's no one definitive study. It's a collection of whole lots of bits of scientific information. But basically, to sum it all up, I think what studies and findings and debate has come to over the last couple of years is that untreated HIV is bad at all stages, from the beginning to very advanced infection. It is not good. And that there are undoubtedly benefits in keeping your CD4 count as high as possible, and equally importantly, keeping the virus suppressed. Studies have demonstrated that treatment lowers the risk of developing kidney, liver, cardiovascular, cancers, osteoporosis and neurological complications, which a range of studies have found that people with HIV are at a higher risk of developing than the rest of the population. And also that treatment of very early HIV infection may reduce damage, may reduce the risks of developing those problems I just referred to. So these problems and HIV illnesses, etc., are not just caused by immune deficiency. They're believed to be caused by inflammation, which is ongoing, caused by HIV, even when people are on treatment. But at least if you're on treatment, it reduces the level of that inflammation, and that can have spin-off benefits. We've seen a lot of advances in drugs. We've got really a huge array of drugs now. Most of them are well tolerated. The ones that cause us lots of problems, like AZT and D4T and DDI and some of the really old protease inhibitors, have all been retired, except in, unfortunately, a few places in Africa, etc. And so we have pretty well-tolerated drugs. In many cases, you can get a number of drugs in one pill. All of this is, I think, leading us to what we should recognise as a third distinct treatment era, and that is where people can be put on a drug combination. They will stay on that combination for very, very long term. We should forget this notion that treatment should be staged for failure. Stage 1, fail. Stage 2, move on. That is not happening. It is happening for some people, but it's usually because they don't have the supports in place, or they're not committed to treatment, or whatever. So, there's a lot of evidence about early treatment, but there are also arguments for deferring treatment. And I think we always need to remind ourselves and challenge ourselves about those. People will always argue that we need more studies, that we need definitive studies to answer every question. That's fair enough. That's got to be balanced against the risk of people getting infected, disease progression, illness and death. There are always concerns about unknown side effects and toxicities. Yes, that's fair enough. But a lot of these drugs have now been around a long time, and their safety record is pretty good. This is a concern that should be kept in the back of our mind, but I don't think it's as prominent. Resistance. Yes, there is always the possibility of developing resistance, but the new drugs are much more robust. It's pretty important, pretty bad news if you missed just a few doses a few years ago. You would very likely develop resistance, but the drugs are much more robust and can certainly seem to stand the odd missing of doses and that sort of thing. The argument is if we put a lot more people, there will be costs. Yes, there will be. Certainly the drug bill will go up, but then that has to be matched against the cost of people getting sick, stopping work, entering hospital, dying, whatever. The final thing, and this is entirely valid, is that treatment requires a lifelong commitment, and that is a big commitment, and people shouldn't start unless they are committed. That's as true today as it was 10 years ago. So what we do, or what our doctors do and what we advocate for, is usually based on treatment guidelines. These are on the ASHM website and links through the AFAO and NAPWA, etc. The ones we follow in Australia, and this was a decision taken by our Ministerial Advisory Committee, our national one, is to follow the US guidelines for antiviral treatment. And what we do in Australia is write a local commentary on those. This is not a second guessing of the US guidelines, it's pointing out differences in drug availability, different tests, different